Thanks for watching. I'm Angela, and this is Everyday Expertise. And today's video, I'm talking with Keith Heistermann. He's one of the founding members of a pop culture website called 9to5.cc. And as happens sometimes on this show, we talked about a lot of stuff. So I have divided this video into two parts. And in part one, we talk about what the website is. It's a pop culture website. It has comics and blogs and podcasts, and he especially is a host of 3 of those podcasts. So we get into what those podcasts are, and we talk about being an independent producer, and also we get into the process of actually making a podcast. And then watch the very end, because we get interrupted by a very adorable furry friend. In part 2, we get into more of the nitty gritty, the motivations, the why he does what he does, and so I really hope you will enjoy it. I think you will. I really like the interview. And make sure you tune in for part 2 when it's up. Thanks. Hi, I'm Angela, and this is Everyday Expertise, and I'm here today with Keith Heistermann. He is a co-founder of the pop culture website 9to5.cc.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, where he blogs, makes comics, and co-hosts 2 of their podcasts.
3 podcasts.
3 podcasts.
3 podcasts.
I missed that one.
2 bi-weekly, and we do a wrestling one.
You need to update your bio.
I don't mind you missing the wrestling one. It's very niche.
All right.
It's literally like a wrestling podcast with like a focus on Quebec wrestling.
The other ones.
The other ones
are called the 9to5 Entertainment System.
Yep.
And Go Plug Yourself.
Yep.
Yeah.
Those are the 2 main ones. Admittedly, the new one, the wrestling one is more new. So it's okay. It only has 15 episodes as opposed to like 160 of the other ones.
Well, like I said, you need to update your bio on the website.
I guess so.
Yeah.
My bad.
Yeah. Okay. So, first, what is 9to5.cc and how to get started?
9to5.cc started off as basically an email chain, if that makes sense. It was basically myself and the other people who kind of started the site. So it was like myself, Scott, Sophie, and John emailed each other back and forth during our 9to5 jobs. Right. And it was just like complete... Hang on, do you swear on this at all? I was about to... I'll avoid swearing. Yeah. It was just shooting the crap.
Yeah.
on a day-to-day basis. Like we're talking about like movies that we watched, like books that we read, video games that we were playing, just like linking articles or whatever. Just like literally joking amongst each other in an email chain. And like it would be not uncommon for us to have like well over 100 emails shared in a day. And we just like made ourselves laugh. And I think the first official kind of like 9to5.cc thing that we ever did was Sophie, who's the artist who does all the art on our on the comics. She drew little doodles of myself, Sophie, and Scott. Myself, herself, and Scott, I should say. And then Scott would actually go through the emails and kind of like actual cut and paste little like snippets of dialogue and turn it into the original dialogue for the comics. You can go on the website still. I think if you go and click comic in the top bar and then scroll down, there's a link you can click classics. And you can see all those old, like that was I think 2010, 2011. Yeah. And then we were like, that's fun, we made comics. And then we were like, what else can we do? And we were like, well, blogging is quote unquote easy because we're like, we can just write. So we're writing to each other a bunch of the emails. And then somewhere along the line, I was like, I think I could figure out podcasting. I was like, I think I could you just buy some mics and plug them into a computer. It's that easy. It was not that easy, but that was sort of the, like, I was like, oh, people, just people talking. Like, we talk all the time. We could do a podcast. So, yeah, and then at some point, we brought kind of like podcasts into the mix. And then the whole idea was basically that we were just like people who were kind of like, not to say like trapped in dead-end jobs or whatever, but it was like we were people who had 9to5 jobs and careers that didn't necessarily fulfill us like creatively. Right. Like even if they were like I like my job, and I think like Sophie and Scott and John all like their jobs too, but it's not like you're like scratching that creative itch much when you're working. Like we basically all at the time all worked within like kind of the IT realm and stuff. So it's like you're not being super creative when you're just like you're like
probably not.
Yeah, I do IT project management or whatever. You're like it's fun. I mean, it's not fun, but it's like engaging. But then so we wanted a place that kind of like output creatively where and we were just like, let's just do a website where we can kind of like set our own terms of what it's about and what we can do. So it's like there's been I've written fiction on the website. I've covered like we've done movie reviews. What's up some of the other like I guess like weirder stuff, like there's been like weird like Photoshop stuff that Scott I should say has done. Like he did one thing for a couple months where it was just like pictures of Kanye West and just like quotes of Noam Chomsky, and it was just like there was nothing else to it, but he was like, it makes me laugh, and I was like, they're pretty fun, like, and there's like very little editorializing, like as long as it's not like garbage, we'll put it up on the website because it's like the website is to make us happy. Like the only time it kind of like becomes, I guess, more pro is if we're accredited or something to like a festival, or if we get movie passes to something, we're like, okay, let's put on our like big boy hats and actually like take this seriously, like a kind of a mini job. So yeah, I guess that's the 9 to 5 story, more or less.
Basically. So you don't have any sponsorship or anything like that? You don't seem to have any ads?
No, we started off with a couple ads and we got rid of them. A, they weren't generating a ton of revenue, and B, we were like, we weren't super happy with like that having ads, because we were like, the idea was to kind of do it for ourselves. We recently launched a Patreon, which we still don't like push enough. Like, I think we like mentioned it maybe once or twice in the podcast, and there was like a little like link in the banner, but like we're really like sensitive to asking people for money. Like we're like, I don't want to do that, because we're in a position where we like kind of have the means to run the website independently, like where it's like we can. It's not a huge expense to pay for the say the podcast hosting and the web hosting and stuff, and like basically John and I foot the bill, and we're like, by kind of keeping it to ourselves, it gives us that editorial sort of freedom of just like doing whatever. It's like if we don't put up a post in a week, like it bums me out on the personal level, but I'm like, it's not like we're like accountable to anyone, like you know, whereas I'm like, if you have like
you stay independent.
Yeah, exactly, that's it. I mean, even the Patreon, like I mean, like obviously if you're watching this video, support us on Patreon, go, yay.
We'll have links to anything relevant in the description of this video.
But like even the Patreon, where it's just sort of like, yeah, it's a normal thing on a Patreon to be like, if you pay us this much money a month, we will start doing this blog, or we'll start doing this additional feature, whatever, which is super cool. And don't get me wrong, if people do like contribute money, we will totally like we will hold up those pledges, but you still have like this accountability to your fans, which I mean I think you kind of always do, but we prefer kind of keeping the accountability to ourselves, because it just kind of keeps us independent, because the whole idea was for it to be an outlet to our jobs, not necessarily to like become
a job.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why we kind of like said we stopped running ads, and we like sort of haven't really looked for any like sponsorship deals or whatever. There's been a few times where people have like kind of offered them, and we're like, no, like kind of pass, like and I mean like not to say like I don't need the money, but it's just sort of like the amount of sort of freedom that you'd give up for what would come out to be like maybe like a couple $100 a month.
Yeah.
You know, you'd be like, okay, now I'm like fully accountable to this like store.
Yeah.
You know, or you're just sort of like, oh, and if they're like, hey, talk about this product, and we're like, oh, we didn't talk about it on 90S this month because we got busy. Like there's so many times where if you are a subscriber to our Patreon, you'll see that we usually post what we think we're going to talk about on 90S. And I would say like more than half of the time we don't get to all the items we think, like going into the podcast, we're like, we're probably going to talk about these 4 or 5 things, and we talk about like 2 of them.
You just ran.
So if you had to suddenly like insert in say like a corporate plug or like a talking about a thing, it would just kind of limit our freedom a little bit, which we were not super down with.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the podcasts.
Cool.
90S, Go Plug Yourself. What are they? Like if you're describing them to someone who doesn't know what they are.
Well, so Go Plug Yourself is pretty, I find, easy to describe. Basically, once every 2 weeks, we sit down with someone in Montreal who has something to plug. And I guess we kind of like, we always make a joke that we lure people into the podcast with the promise that they're going to plug their thing. And then Walter and I just essentially talk about whatever we want with a person who's there who's trying to plug their thing. Walter J. Ling is my co-host on that one. He's a Montreal comedian who you could see him on commercials and stuff. He just did the Vachon commercials. It was hilarious. Huh. But yeah, and the criteria of being on the show is essentially, most of the time you need to be a Montrealer. We've had a couple of non-Montrealers who are just doing something in Montreal. But I would say out of like 160 episodes, I would say like 150 of them are Montrealers.
Yeah.
And you just have to have something to plug. So we've had like visual artists. Like we had, why am I blanking on his name? The guy who did Swamp Thing in the New 52, Yannick
Paquet?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah. Like we had comic book artist. We've had a lot of comedians on. We've had musicians.
You just had the guy from John Jacob Magistrate.
Yeah. We had Johnny Griffin from John Jacob Magistrate on. We had the Planet Smashers on the week before that. I don't know when this is going to come up. At our most recent episode, we'll have another podcaster on, Yannick Belzil, who's the host of Trois Bières, which is like one of the big French language podcasts. So we had him on. So yeah, it's like there's really no criteria of, and a lot of times people are like, oh, I don't usually give interviews, because like a lot of visual artists and stuff are not necessarily in a position where they want to talk about themselves as much as, say, a comedian
of course
would want to. And we're like, no, don't worry about it. We're like, we'll get you talking, and once you're talking, it's fine. And as a result, like most of the feedback that we've had has been really positive about a show like Go Plug Yourself, because even though it's called Go Plug Yourself, we try to get away from the traditional actual plugging. Where it's like we've had I think 2 or 3 times we've had Sugar Sammy on, and it's kind of funny because he's so used to doing these really intense press junkets kind of thing, and he's in such a plug go mode, talking about his start dates and talking about whatever, and it's like every time it takes about 5 to 10 minutes of us sort of disarming him before he settles in and is like, oh, we're just talking. We're just talking, and I don't need to hit all my dates and stuff. And I was and I find that sort of where the podcast and where it succeeds. And like I said, from our listeners and even from our guests are often they're like, oh, that was not what I expected it to be. They're like, it was really good, but you're like, I thought it was going to be more just talking about where I'm from and the art and stuff. And we're like, we will get to that. That is a thing that we will talk about on the podcast, but it's much more fun to just kind of talk to our guests as people. So that's what Go Plug Yourself is talking to talented Montrealers as people, so you can kind of, I think, maybe not to say humanize them. I mean, they're humans, but you know what I mean? I think so that you can view them as individuals and not just as artists. Right. I guess is sort of the goal.
How did you get started doing it? The idea and getting that going? Yeah.
Walter and I, we were literally just sitting around in the park. I had just bought 90S was first by a week or 2 tops. Yeah. And I just started the idea of I can do podcasts. And I was like, well, I'm buying some mics. And I was like, hey, Walter, we should do a podcast. And we were like, well, what's it going to be? And I was like, well, he wasn't up at the time, kind of establishing himself as a comedian. This was, I think, around 2011. He's well established now. He just had a Just for Laugh show. Oh. But it was he was just kind of establishing himself as a comedian. And we were we knew a couple of musicians. So we're between the amount of musicians and comedians and stuff that we knew personally, we're we have a good 10 episodes just asking people that we know. And if we're and if we do a good 10 episodes, then we can start to use those 10 episodes as kind of background to be hey, person who we don't know, look at these 10 episodes that we've done, and kind of build from there, you know? So it's what I'd say, probably our first big-ish guest would be, we had Mike Patterson on, kind of, I think maybe in the first 20, probably. And we had Sammy on early, too. And it was just because those guys knew Walter a little bit through the comedian scene, and that was kind of they were doing it much more at the time as favors to us. We always joke, we're there's two types of Go Plug Yourself guests. There's the ones where we're giving them some exposure, and then there's the some where you're you don't need to be doing this. You're much bigger than doing our podcast, Sugar Sammy. You sold out the Olympia 50 times in a row or something. You really don't need to be coming to Back of Grumpy's to talk about it. You're doing it as a favor to us because you like us a little bit. One of the other ones like that was, oh my God, I feel so terrible. I'm blanking on his name. He plays Nacho on Better Call Saul. Michael Mando.
Right.
There we go. So we had Michael Mando on once because we knew some people at Ubisoft, weirdly, because we also ended up having one of the Ubisoft game directors on. And he played one of the main villains in Far Cry 3. And he had such a good time on the show that he literally was like, messaged us one Christmas right after filming Better Call Saul. And he was like, I'm back in town. He's like, could we do the podcast again? And we're like, what? And we're like, you're on television now, man. We're like, you're on an AMC show in like a pretty like starring, not necessarily starring role, but like a strong supporting character on the sequel to Breaking Bad. And then it was this hilarious thing where we were like, oh, he's like, oh, it's no problem. He's like, we have to get the sign off from like AMC and stuff. And we're like, what? We're like, they're never going to sign off on you just coming back to Montreal and doing this like random podcast. But the AMC people were super nice.
Oh,
and they were like, they just wanted a copy of it to listen to make sure they weren't talking about spoilers and all that stuff. But yeah, that was just a straight up like Michael Mando had a good time and was like, oh, I'm back in town. I'll give like Walter and Keith a call.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a lot of fun. And 90S, I guess, is the less. It's kind of like hard to explain what 90S is. I mean, like we just sort of call it like a weekly pop culture kind of like roundtable. But it's like if you listen to it a lot, you'll kind of hear that that's not quite right. Like that is mostly what it's about, but we're not nearly as current as a lot of most pop culture podcasts are. Like a lot of pop culture podcasts are like very concerned about like
that's true.
What's coming out right now. We're
behind
like
a little,
we're behind. Like often we'll only talk about a movie in depth when all three of us have seen it. Like the most recent episode, like we finally talked about Infinity War, which if you're like a legitimate pop culture podcast, you're like, that's really late. You know? We also do weird current event-y stuff a little bit more, I find, than a lot of other pop culture podcasts, because John kind of like reads up on weird news articles a lot of the time, and he'll bring those. Like often, I would say a lot of the episodes even start with like news items, you know, which is a little bit different. And I guess like the whole reason that one sort of started out was one of the hosts on that one, Scott, became a dad, and he was like, I still want to see my friends. And so he was like, it's kind of hard for him to get out necessarily. I mean, it's a little bit easier now. His kid's a little older, but it was kind of hard for him at the time to get out and like he couldn't just like go grab a beer with his buddies randomly. But he was like, I can, if it's a podcast, get out of the house once every 2 weeks for a couple hours, like sit down with you guys and just kind of like see where it goes. And it's like 90S is like sort of, it's again like sort of like the whole website. It's like whatever we kind of want it to be.
That makes sense. I've heard a few of them in preparation for this.
Cool.
And I think the best way to describe it is kind of like you're listening in on a group of geeks. Talking about whatever they want to talk about.
Pretty much. Exactly. That's actually been
with a little more structure than that.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. With a little bit of structure, but we do like a little. Both shows we try to go for kind of like a very minimal amount of editing. Like unless something goes like not to say off the rails topic wise, we'll keep that. But unless like literally people are like stumbling all over their words and becoming a disaster, like we'll keep almost everything. Like really, the only thing we'll edit out is like audio issues. Right. Like but otherwise we keep it like pretty tight. If there's really really long dead air, maybe we'll cut that, but it's like we try to keep it very minimal editing. And I mean that as a result, if you go back and listen to the early ones, they're pretty like they're very rough because like we didn't know what we were doing, we didn't have an audience, like like we've actually been talking about it of sort of like I think retiring maybe the first 50 episodes of both podcasts just to be like maybe put them on the Patreon as like a Patreon exclusive or something.
Patreon exclusive, where we started.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Because like a lot of people, like we were just was like talking to some people who found us because we do sort of like special episodes around some of the festivals. Like we did kind of we did some Osheaga specials, we did Heavy Montreal specials, we did some Fantasia film podcast specials. So like sometimes people find the website through the specials, and like some guy reached out and was like, I listened to your Osheaga podcasts, had like enjoyed them really good. He's like, I see you have a bunch of other podcasts. He's like, where do I start? I'm like, that's a loaded question. I was like, not at number one. I was like, don't start at number one. I was like, 90S you can like I would say start currently and work backwards if you enjoy it. And I was like, in terms of go plug yourself, I was like, you could A, do the same thing, or B, you could like take a look through the list and see if there's anyone you want to listen to.
Maybe we should make best of playlists.
Yeah, that's it. Maybe we should like we always joke like there's I think
Keith's favorites. Scott's favorites.
Yeah, there's like there's one episode which to this day is like one of our like all-time highest downloads, which I don't understand why. It's like an early episode of 90s called like Bizort or whatever, and it's just like John has this really like weird energy throughout the entire thing. Like he was just like, I don't know if he like had just like drank like 2 Red Bulls or something before recording, but he's just like so jazzed and excited.
Yeah.
He also keeps saying Bizort like again and again, and it's just like, and it just resonated.
I don't think it's as much of a mystery as you think.
Yeah, I guess, but it's just like it's especially if you listen to like most of his recordings,
Yeah.
it's like it's very unlike him, and I think like enough people like spread it around being like, John sounds real weird on this one. Like, yeah, we also yeah, like we have a couple that I really enjoy where we did like, I think we did a 2-part series again pretty early on where we talked about, it was like probably our most structured episodes where we talked about each one of us how we got into playing RPGs, like tabletop and LARPing RPGs. So it was just like talking about like geeky origin stories kind of. So those ones are pretty fun.
That's cool.
But yeah, so yeah, 90s is very much like whatever we kind of want to talk about it. And I was like, and I've always said if anyone is like interested in listening to 90s, I'm like literally I was like at this point, which is like episode 160 something, if you listen to one of them and you like it, I'm like, it's mostly that. And I was like, if you listen and you don't like, it's probably not for you.
Yeah.
You know, but I'm like, it's really that, like, that's what it is.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, so this show is very much about process.
Okay.
So can you walk me through like making a podcasting episode from like beginning to when it's ready to go up on the website?
Okay. Like creatively or
Yeah,
like technically? Because I was like, technically, I was like, right now we're on our, essentially, I would say our...
How much planning goes into each episode?
Okay, because I was going to say, just to like begin it, like technically speaking, we're on, like I said, I think about our 3rd audio setup over time. So step 1, I think, is like have good mics. like that's just, or not even necessarily good, consistent. Like, and we talk about like planning and stuff, like there's, that was one of the things that we realized really early on, and just in terms of like the overall planning of having a podcast was they don't even need to be the best mics as long as they're just like all kind of the same. Because like the worst podcasts in the world are the ones that like where someone's really well mic'd and then someone sounds like they're in a tin can and someone you're like, that's terrible.
Yeah.
So step 1 is have your gear in check. And also, I mean, I guess do recording tests in your environments and stuff to figure out how it's going to sound out. Like, cause like, for instance, Go Plug Yourself, we recorded at the back of Grumpy's, and it was like really important. We're like, how are we going to record in the back of a bar and have it not sound like crap? Like a lot of tabletop mics would just pick up way too much sound and it would just sound like getting blasted because you really can't control the audio in a bar. So figure out your recording to the place and figure out your mics is step 1. Creatively, 90s at this point essentially writes itself. Like, let's say, like, we'll have a quick email exchange back and forth to be like, what stuff do we want to talk about? What stuff did we say we were going to talk about? If we actually like made an on-air promise, did we say we were going to talk about this? We'll sort of have an email chain kind of going back and forth for a couple days beforehand. And then usually once we're actually sitting down, we set up here in the living room and we talk about like, we'll do like a quick, maybe like 5 minutes of like, what is someone like the most passionate about? Like, what do we want to kind of like lead with? Like, what is the thing you're the most jazzed for kind of thing? And then, and that's sort of our lead in. In terms of how we sort of structure it, we have a clock that we sort of like have set up, and I'll sort of go, host is not the right word because like we're all kind of hosting, but I would say like I sort of steer the conversation.
So you sort of work like a moderator in a way?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. If I'm like, I'll take a look at the clock and I'll be like, okay, we've been talking about this one thing for a really long time. It's time to move on. Or because I know that Scott wants to talk about XYZ movie, I'll be like, hey, Scott, you told me you saw some movies or whatever. And just sort of like kind of break it apart that way. And that's how 90S works.
Yeah.
Go Plug Yourself is a little bit trickier because scheduling and stuff is a bit of a pain because Walter is a working comedian.
Yeah.
So he's got shows and he travels, like he's out in the Maritimes doing like a tour right now. And then there's also the schedule of our guest. There's also the process of finding a guest. Like we'll sort of sit there and this sounds terrible to say, but it's like we'll we'll go out of our way to try to not have comedians on in terms of the early planning, because we are friends with a lot of them. So it's like when we're trying to book a guest, we know that the comedians will say yes. If that makes sense. So, and not to say like, oh, they're sitting around and doing nothing. It's just because they're closer to our like our friend circle. So it's just like it's a lot easier to call up someone like Chris Mendito or Reese Turner or whatever, who are like actively producing shows in Montreal. So it's not like it's not just like a filler or whatever, but like we hang out with them on the weekends anyway. So it's like it's a little bit easier to be like, hey, we need an episode for this next Tuesday or Wednesday if they have a show coming up.
Yeah.
We try to kind of keep tabs on stuff coming up in town that we enjoy, you know. So it's like if we see, you know, this person is, or this this person or this performer is doing like a vernissage, or there's like a book release, or has a show coming up or whatever, we'll reach out to them and try to get something that fits their schedule so that it's close to the thing that they're that they want to plug,
right?
Which we won't let them plug. But yeah, so it's like this kind of like mishmash between myself and Walter, looking around at schedules of what people have coming up in town and figuring it out. Then we kind of get together at Grumpy's. We'll do, I would say, maybe about a 5 to 10 minute pre-interview where we just talk about the stuff, again, kind of like that they absolutely want to talk about. Like if we really want them, we want to make sure we get to the album date or whatever.
Yeah.
We'll make sure that that's incorporated. Sometimes we'll be like, is there anything we can't talk about? Which is another thing that we talked about with Michael Mando. Like he was NDA'd on a bunch of stuff for Better Call Saul. So he's like, yeah, you can't ask me that. And we'll usually, and like I said, we keep it pretty loose. So we're like, if we ask a question that he can't answer, he can just be like, I can't answer that, you know? So, and I mean, like I said, some people are much more open with what they're sort of like willing to talk about. I mean, if you listen to the John Jacob Magistery episode, like Johnny Griffin was like, here's some stuff that's going on with my family. And you're like, whoa, that was really intense. Thanks for sharing. You know, but it was like, but he was like cool with that. And we're like, okay, yeah. We're like,
you guys kind of like beat around the bush a bit before you actually got to it.
Well, we didn't know necessarily.
I think he was sort of like, what are they trying to ask me?
Yeah. No, but I mean, but it worked out because, like I said, he is working for like an innocence advocacy group for his dad and all that stuff. So like, you're just sort of like, it is like a weird topic to broach. Go listen to that episode, by the way, if you're not understanding what we're talking about. It's a good episode. But yeah, exactly. And it was funny too because we ran into them later at Osheaga. Ran into Joey, who's the manager, I guess, and Johnny, who's from John Jacob Magistracy, and they were like, yeah, they're like, it was a little weird. They're like, but they were like, ultimately like, we're glad we got there and like we got to the point of what we were trying to say. But we're like, it's mostly a comedy podcast, so we're like, how do we bring this up without like being super awkward? So like that's the other thing we kind of try to keep in mind is that we do try to keep it like pretty light, and we tell our guests usually like, you can talk about whatever you want. Like there's an episode, I would say it's our least funny episode is, I don't know if you remember, Joey Elias got into some hot water over like a language dispute. This would be a couple years ago. I don't remember. He tweeted something about someone like an STM employee or whatever had put up a sign in French only, basically saying, "Oh, we will only serve you in French." And he just like posted a picture of that, and it like caught a lot online. And at the time he was, I don't know if he still is, at the time he was working on CJD, and CJD straight up told him, "Don't talk about this on air." And he was like, well, I know Walter has a podcast. And so like, it's like a very serious, like the state of Quebec politics and the state of Quebec language law. Like, and Joey is like, who's usually a very funny comedian, is like very serious about it. And we were like, we knew it was going to be serious going in, but he was literally asking, he's like, I want to sit down and talk about this in an uncensored fashion. Will you guys put me on the show? And we were like, sure. No problem.
Why not?
So we did that, But if you go back and listen to that episode expecting it to be like a laugh riot with Joey Ryan, like not Joey Ryan, Joey Elias. It's not. You know, like it's like a very serious talking about like the state of Quebec language, like politics and stuff.
Well, now I need to go back and listen to it.
There you go.
All right. So basically then you've got sort of planning and then recording, and then once it's recorded, what do you do?
I forget about it for a little while. And then I'm like, oh crap, I need to publish an episode and I need to go into editing.
Yeah. How long does editing take for you?
It really depends on the episode and how many, if any, sort of like outtakes or anything we need. Hey, dog. Don't knock over the mic stand.
Oh, look at that.
Say
We
hi.
have a guest.
The best.
Oh, that was part 1. And I hope you thought that dog was cute. I thought he was adorable. She was adorable. So make sure to tune into part 2 when it's up. It'll be up soon. And to see the rest of our interview. Thank you for watching. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this interview. Be sure to share this video with friends and colleagues who may also enjoy this topic. Let us know your thoughts by leaving a comment below or check the description for our social media. See you next time.